Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and the Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.
Welcome, folks, to the Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
And I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We're coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, good old Des Moines, Iowa, on Iowa Catholic Radio. This is the Uncommon Good, and we are so happy to have you with us. I'm Bo Bonner. I am the Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and the Director for the Center for Human Flourishing over at Mercy College. Bud, what do you do over there?
Bud Marr, I work as the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and I feel like in the intro to the show, I said my name with intentionality and verve. Sort of like I was being interviewed for a job, like, I'm Bud Marr.
Or you're selling a car. I'm Bud Marr.
I'm a used car
approve
salesman.
Of these messages. Or you're running for office. Hey, have we ever told anyone on air that you at one point were asked to run for president? Do you remember this?
To throw my name in the hat. I don't know if I would have received the nomination. Should we leave the political party off air?
No, I think we have to say it so that people don't but
we can't endorse them on air.
Correct.
So we're just
no, it's not an endorsement, but there's. Because, so the American Solidarity Party, didn't it have a lot of people who just happen to live in Pittsburgh or something?
Yeah, the meeting was in Pittsburgh, and there were a lot of Pittsburgh folks there.
When you were in Pittsburgh at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I was offered the, I was asked to consider to throw my name in the hat for the nominee for the party.
Yeah.
The guy who won it had a stronger beard game than me, so I was probably sunk.
A strong.
I didn't know how
a stronger magician game at one point, right? Or is this a different person?
I don't know. I'm not sure how my employer at the time would have handled me running for president.
I know.
And also representing the Institute.
How does anybody's employer, how do you stay employed and say, oh, by the way, I'm running for president? Not only, of course, you'd have no chance, and basically no one but the two parties have any chance. Sorry, but how do you just sort of keep a straight face? I'm imagining you're selling something. You're oh, also I'm running for president, but I have to go to this board meeting. I don't know. You have to clock in. It's just a weird idea.
In retrospect, I probably should have jumped on it because that is a great entry point for conversations at backyard barbecues.
That's true.
And I'm socially awkward, so that would have been my foot in the door.
You really could have anybody's well, I don't know what the answer is, because this is a while, it's not a while ago, a few days back, we played trivia together. By the way, everyone should know our team won, but we'll leave it at that. If it came up, whose answer should we go for? You could have just said, I don't know, who in this group has ran for president? And then that would probably mean that we'd have to go with your answer, right?
I thought you were going to say this would be a part of standard trivia games. Who was the 2020 presidential nominee for the American Solidarity Party?
That's right. Wow, where did we get off? Where did we just end up talking about this?
I was talking about how I said my name, which is always difficult for me at the start of the show because I don't know the inflection to use.
That's true.
Do I end it in sort of an interrogative, I'm Bud Marr?
Bud Marr or Bud Marr, right? Well, one thing we always know what to say is thank you to Mercy College of Health Sciences for underwriting our show. mchs.edu. We are landing the plane on the aircraft carrier of the semester, Bud. People have turned in papers. They have done their final tests. So we're saluting our students and hoping that they're having a good Christmas break. But we did it, buddy, man. We got here to the end. And if you want to be part of that great effort that happens every semester, mchs.edu. Once more, thank you, Mercy College, for underwriting the show.
Yeah, we're broadcasting the show actually on the official final day of the semester. We often end on Saturdays because we have clinicals. So I know we don't have the webcam in the studio anymore, but if you could see me, I'm doing that thing that runners do when they break the tape. And it feels so good. So love being at Mercy College of Health Sciences and also love wrapping up a successful semester.
Absolutely. mchs.edu. Thank you, Mercy College. Today on the show, we're going to be playing an interview that we got to do, talk to our great friend Dave Delio, who runs the Newman Idea. We're going to talk to him about Newman. It's a sort of special icing on the cake for all of this Newman radio reading roundup. He had a fantastic essay in a new book, and we want to make sure people can hear about it. So we're going to be talking with the Uncommon Good All-Star Dave Delio, who's been on the show before. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, stick around. We'll be back right after this. The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. It is always wonderful to have you with us, whether you're listening to Iowa Catholic Radio through the radio waves, or if you're on iowacatholicradio.com listening live, the Iowa Catholic Radio app, or, of course, our beautiful, wonderful, scholarly, saintly podcast listeners. We're glad to have you on the show. Bud, today it's a festival of such because we have a long-time all-star with us today who's been on the show multiple times, but it's been a while since he's been on the show. We're glad to have in studio our great friend Dave Delio back with us. But let's talk about what it is he's been up to lately. That's going to be the subject for our show today.
So, Dave, you've got this essay in a book that was recently published, A Guide to John Henry Newman, and it's fascinating. I really was a big admirer of the essay, but it touches on, you and I both have a devotion to St. John Henry Newman, who was canonized back in fall of 2019. And recently, some nerds, some scholars have kind of gone after Newman for what he says about liberalism. Famously, a professor at Yale University, Frank Turner, and just long story short, he accused Newman of sort of using the word liberalism as a cipher and being sort of like inconsistent in doing so, that Newman had kind of a hang-up about evangelicals in the Church of England, but used liberalism as sort of like a rearguard attack against that group. That's probably a little far afield for the purposes of the show, but Newman, this great saint, at the end of his life, he talks about how his entire career, like his adult ministry, he was a priest, scholar, poet, was one long battle against liberalism. And a show like ours that's about the common good, that term gets thrown around a lot today. We did want to emphasize at the start of the show, we're not thinking today when we talk about liberalism about like party politics and maybe how the term is used on CNN or Fox News. But I think Newman had a real, genuine, serious concern that's still alive in our midst today. So when Newman said his life could be understood as a battle against liberalism, what was he concerned about in his own context?
Guys, it's great to be back with you. Really excited to be here again on the Uncommon Good. And yeah, we're kind of going at something different today. Normally we've talked about the ministry that I have, which is the Newman idea, and that's one of my ways of doing one of my devotions to Newman is trying to educate how he did. A couple of years ago, I was asked to write a chapter on liberalism, and to be honest with you, I had no desire to. I wanted to write on Newman's educational life. And the editor of the book said, look, we already have that base covered. We really need someone to do this because I think the record needs to be corrected. And I never had paid attention to it. I'd always just kind of, I knew about it, but it never really interested me and not to mention what you said earlier, Bud, about how you just hear the word liberal and you automatically think of a political party or a type of person. Yeah. And so I was like, I don't want to wade into those waters. And I will tell you, though, it was, always follow invitations. If you get good invitations, follow them. And I'm so glad I did. Not only did I learn a lot about Newman, I think I corrected a problem in kind of Newman studies along the way, but also it helped shape and form my own political thinking. I can't unthink now what the word liberalism and all its connotations mean, because you have, like, on the one hand, you have these positive senses of like the liberal arts. Everybody loves the liberal arts because it's about like the free exercise of your mind over and trying to master both skill and knowledge as a free person would have the opportunity. On the other hand, we all love, just within recent memory, Independence Day, we love liberty, right? So, well, liberalism, liberty, and liberal arts are all kind of interrelated to the same term. And so once I kind of understood how Newman thought about it, I realized I agreed with him. And it shaped my thinking on both kind of ecclesiastical matters, matters in the life of the church, but also political matters as well.
I know that it's easy to, unlike these two gentlemen that you just heard on the show, folks, both Dave and Bud, who are legit Newman scholars. If you cut them, Apologia comes out. They're Newman people. I always say that I am a permanent resident alien in Newman studies, that you guys have always been very nice to let me come do my dirty philosophical sort of questions with Newman, and so I always feel happy to be a part of it. But I do know that this is a dead horse about Newman that I love to kick, but I think it immediately goes into this. I've worried about utilitarianism in all of its forms, but specifically in education for a long time now. Utilitarianism being the idea that you should do whatever has the most utility, right? That it's consequentialism. You decide what's best based on what you think the outcomes will be. There's all sorts of philosophical problems with this. But in education, the history of utilitarianism in education is where we get up thinking that, all education is preparing people essentially for jobs or functions in society, and leaves aside the idea that knowledge is good for its own sake, very core to Newman's thought and how Newman pushes against what was going on at his time, which was the predominance of utilitarianism in education in the history of his time in England. But Dave, don't you think this might be a natural point maybe to jump off to people who are unfamiliar with this? Liberalism, not simply, like you said, as our political notion of it, but not even a political notion when Newman's talking about it. There's this new emphasis about a sort of pragmatic take on nearly everything Christendom held important. Economics is pragmatic, ethics is pragmatic, education is pragmatic, and that this starts to be part of what Newman sees as his grand vocation in all that he did. There's various things, a varied life that he writes on, but this is what weds together his historical theology, his talk on education, his theories of knowledge, etc., is liberalism sort of reducing things to their usefulness, even if people didn't intend that when they advocated for those things.
Sure. I mean, I think there is definitely something to that line of thinking, and I think at the heart of it, Newman felt liberalism, he did not attack it as an ideology right away, and I'll tell you why. That the word kind of took a long time to come into play. That the word liber is a Latin word, that's always been around, and liberty is in the English sense had always been around. But the word, the adding of the ism to it to make it this kind of big concept, that didn't happen until about the first or second decade of the 19th century. And there's a really cool book on it's called The Lost History of Liberalism. And in the book, the author notes that the first time they heard the word was in a Spanish newspaper in the early 19th century. But it quickly gained a lot of steam amongst French intellectuals, then British intellectuals, because a lot of French intellectuals were still fleeing France in the wake of the French Revolution and then Napoleon's kind of dictatorship. And so it created this kind of culture or atmosphere, intellectual culture in England. And Lord Byron wrote he began a journal called The Liberal, where he was trying to kind of incorporate what was going on in European thought, and this is the key thing that I want you to see it as, or that I really learned in the process, is that liberalism, when it first kind of came into being, it saw itself as a direct rival and it wanted to take on Christian culture because it wanted to usurp the culture. And this is kind of the French, they weren't even using the word, but the ideology of it was there. What happened is Christian culture pushed back. It still had a lot of power. And so what it became is the seminal thinkers, liberal thinkers, and I'm thinking of Benjamin Constant and others, what they said was, we need to make this palatable to people. So it's kind of we can't give them the harsh medicine that we want, we have to give some sugar to it. And so part of what liberalism became is they started to use kind of Christian words and Christian concepts and Christian ideas to kind of say hey, you can, both are good. The difference was no ecclesial authority, so it all becomes a secular civil authority. and then God is kind of pushed out, way out to the margins. Like, you can believe in God, you can tolerate people who believe in God, but or not. And the key architects of it were really in the or not kind of camp. But they didn't want to sell it that way, because if you sold like no God and no church hierarchy or anything like that, that just wasn't going to, the people of the time were not going to buy it. And so.
Yeah, and this is where, like, going back to that distinction we were talking about at the start of the show, I think is really important for us to think through. You know, like, we hear liberalism today, and we may think like liberalism encapsulates a set of political positions that I disagree with and need to resist. And maybe that is a part of public witness for some Catholics. The liberalism that Newman had in view, I think, is more subtle, but maybe more insidious, because it was driven by this concept of like, we could sort of achieve social harmony by downplaying difference. And so, but it really is kind of like a controlling meta-narrative or like worldview of its own, where as Catholics, we know like revealed truths. So what God has revealed in sacred scripture, preserved through tradition, those should have a purchase on our lives. But the liberals who Newman is rubbing shoulders with, they're saying, like, let's not get bogged down in debates about who Christ was, or even necessarily differences between different religions. Like, religion is more of a sentiment. It's fine if you want that to be part of your life, to like be sort of a cap that you wear, but it shouldn't have that kind of purchase that I was just mentioning a few seconds ago. It shouldn't, so to speak, or like it shouldn't like command how we actually order our lives, and especially like public life. So it ultimately ends up sort of pushing true faith to the margins, because anyone who thinks faith is a matter of life and death that actually should structure or command that the way we live our lives, either really at a personal level, but certainly in community, like they're seen as potentially sort of dangerous to the liberal order. I mean, as I'm saying some of this, Bo, it takes me almost back to our Duke days and talking to Stanley Hauerwas, who's a great contemporary thinker who's kind of tackled some of this.
I thought you meant like I had a dukedom at one point. I was like, I don't remember my castle. No, I think that that's important to, you know, Dave, what I think of immediately, the time frames we're talking about. One thing that makes this difficult is when retroactively we ascribe everyone from the Enlightenment forward as a liberal thinker, when actually there were huge debates about who gets included, and there were different wings of interpretation of seminal philosophers that would fall into liberal or not takes to show that this is like, I like how you pointed out this is something that gained steam as people were talking about it and came to a head in such a way that Newman could encapsulate a lot by using the word. I think of someone like Hegel, who has this immense footprint on the time period we're talking about because of German idealism, but he dies, and what's the big debate is like liberal Hegelians versus what is called rightist Hegelians, or whoever you're talking about. And so even people who we think of as quite revolutionary, and in our day just sort of put from like one straight line from the French Revolution to today, it's actually much more up for grabs. Even someone as radical as like Spinoza, who is straight up sort of like a godfather of a lot of materialism that comes later, there's liberal and rightist Spinozaists. And so that's why I think it's important to go, like, when Newman is talking about liberalism in the church and how he saw this in England, he's not saying like, oh, well, we have the saints and then you have these secular philosophers, and I like the saints and I don't like them. John Stuart Mill, who is a utilitarian and has a lot of sway about how universities start looking in and around the time Newman's alive, is making this big quest to actually, like you said, enfold a lot of thinkers into the liberal mindset, which again, even the word, to your point, is sort of purposefully taking a word that was used all over the place in the church, like not only liberal art studies, but the liberality of the liberality of the church and the liberty of the church were two massive arguments going into Vatican I that kind of shows you why I think your essay is so important, because it's so easy for us in 2023 to miss these nuances.
And I think that, like, so when Newman was a young man, he used liberal either as in much more the classical Latin sense of if you were liberal, like you were big-hearted and you were generous. So like you were liberal with your possessions, right? He would use it either that way or he'd use it in just in an education way. What he started to do, though, is when he was at Oxford, he was hanging around a group of guys called the Noetics, and the Noetics were very much into logic, and they were but I would also say that there's a deep vein of skepticism that ran through it. And what Newman first identified as a liberal was someone who he saw it as a mindset. And the mindset was almost automatically to question authority. So that would be your starting point on every single thing. And I mean, even in the modern world today, I mean, you see the bumper stickers, question authority, question everything. That's considered the highest good. I would say that if that's one of your first principles, if that's where you start off, when you have your breakfast in the morning, you're like, I'm going to question authority. Well, I would question General Mills first. But yeah. What I mean by that, if that is where you begin your day and that you begin your thought, most likely you have enfolded yourself into the liberal tradition. Whether you consider yourself a conservative or a liberal. A libertarian today would also question authority, and they're almost allergic to authority, right? That's still part of the liberal tradition, even though they would say, but the liberals are right. So what Newman, what was so important for me with Newman was Newman said it's first is a personal mindset. It's a habit of mind that you develop, and that once it starts to kind of form into groups, into communities, and then cultures of it, then it becomes a project of getting not just like personal authorities, but like bigger authorities, governmental, church authorities, because it sees itself as a rival culture. Liberalism eventually, as the 19th century went on, saw itself as the true rival to the Christian world. And to this day, that's where we are. And
the habit of mind is important. Again, I know I'm picking out all the stuff that I always pick out, but again, idea of the university, habit of mind, right? That's what his whole idea is like. If you have a liberal arts philosophical formation, that is a habit of mind that inclines you to comport yourself towards reality in a different way. So if there's a rival for the habit of mind, it strikes at the heart of not only education, epistemology, but into, like you said, what society thinks it's doing to begin with. And so to just try to pin down liberalism in the 19th century, 20th century England as a set of propositions, I think that's what your insights point out. That misses the point, because actually the history of liberalism in Newman's terminology can change quite a bit. This is the guy who thought things developed, so of course he thought this other culture would develop too. It's that habit of mind that makes the frame of reference that Newman's pointing out. And again, to me, this is why it's so hard for people to notice. It's less, and again, this is me just repeating McLuhan points, it's less the message itself. Liberalism is a medium or a form of engaging these very topics.
Yeah, and I think during the second segment, we can come back to a lot of this. I'm upfront about the fact that I have a strong devotion to Newman as a saint in the church, and I think part of his saintliness was how he navigated these waters. I think Newman left us a great legacy, but part of his legacy, because when you hear these conversations, part of his legacy is how he actually fought the intellectual battles that he did. Because there's a temptation, I think, sometimes in Christianity, in Catholicism, to face these outside forces and become sort of anti-intellectual about it. Like, well, universities have become the vehicles for this kind of like way of thought that's inimical to how we think, and therefore you sort of like reject it out of hand. Newman stayed on the front lines, and he continued to engage these matters, but he showed folks like there's a way that people talk about reason and rationality today where it becomes the final court of appeal, and ultimately it's going to evacuate or empty out what we believe to be true about God and God's dealings with humanity. And that fight hasn't gone away. And in that way, we can look back to Newman and say, like, look, this is an exemplar. He sort of lit the torch, and now we have to carry it in our schools, in our hospitals, in our communities here today in 2023.
And we will continue to carry that torch right after we hear these messages. This is the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr, our good friend Dave Delio, in studio with us today. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We have with us our good friend Dave Delio. It's important I say that because we're talking about a guy who talks about development of doctrine. Dave, I've finally developed, after all these years that I've known you, to have thought, I said it wrong at first, I said Dave Delio, but then I thought your name is actually Dave Delio, so, you know, things develop, just like Newman said. But also, this was sort of insider baseball that I was mispronouncing your name. But I think you had a good point. We were talking over the break a bit about the first half, maybe a bit of insider baseball, but why we think it's important for folks to have slogged through that, because I still think this is very practical, even if you're not a Newman scholar.
Yeah, that's right. We got to the break, and we were just kind of joking about how it got a little deep there in the first half of the show, and just we were throwing around, you know, some writers who have written on these topics. We even mentioned a Yale librarian at one point. But we want to make sure, as you're listening to the show, that you're able to also walk away and say, like, what does this mean for where I'm at today? So I wanted to start, Dave, with Newman's precise words, how he defines liberalism and religion, because I think when our listeners hear this, they're going to see how this is still operative even in parts of our church today. So Newman, in this speech that he gave when he was made a cardinal in the church, says, liberalism in religion is the doctrine that there is no positive truth in religion, but that one creed is as good as another. And this is the teaching which is gathering substance and force daily. It is inconsistent with any recognition of religion as true. It teaches that all are to be tolerated, for all are ultimately matters of opinion. Revealed religion is not a truth, but a sentiment and a taste, not an objective fact, not miraculous, and it is the right of each individual to make it say just what strikes his fancy. Newman goes on, but I'm sure as our listeners hear that and the way he defines liberalism and religion, we have a lot of that today. You think about even like good initiatives, like well-meaning initiatives, like interreligious dialogue. So this idea that you'd bring members of different religions together and they would discuss their differences, that's fine and dandy if the goal of it all is to seek the truth. But so often we start with a liberal premise that the goal is to just sort of like be in the presence of one another and tolerate our differences. You maybe have heard sermons or homilies at some point where there's a miracle in the New Testament. And again, maybe a well-intentioned homilist says like, well, when Jesus fed the 5,000, it ultimately wasn't a miracle, but it was like an initiative or a welcoming to share from the goods and resources that God's given us. That's starting from sort of a liberal premise that there's not the supernatural, that miracles don't take place. And so we're being more rational or reasonable by denying it outright. But it has its own presuppositions that it's saying like a miracle can't happen. So how do we explain this from, again, a sort of liberal standpoint?
And I think, like, you know, these are the things today, like, for example, when you hear, like, on a given issue that, well, we should study that, or we have to, what would the experts say? Or, you know, in other words, liberalism is, if you say something at face value, like, you know, this is our rival, this country is our rival, well, we should really form a commission to study that, because the point is that you're not going to just admit, yes, you're right, that's true, that's what they want to do. You're going to say, I doubt what you're saying, or we have to empirically test it somehow. This idea in liberalism is any claim that you throw out there, it has to be doubted and debated. Am I saying that that's a bad thing? No, Newman's not saying that either. But where he is making a claim on that is in religion. And because he sees something that almost no one in the 19th century saw. He saw liberalism itself as a rival religion. And that was and today, if you want to think about it, so I would say the priestly class of liberalism would be your scientists, right? They wear white robes because there's a sense of purity and there's a sense of, and then your political class would be the political class of experts, right? Would be your kind of your high priestly order, higher than like your bishops or what you know. And so Newman he was making allusions and images of that. And I would just say that the architects of modern liberalism, which I would just say Benjamin Constant would be one of the people out of the wake. He saw the violence and terror of the French Revolution, and he's like, there's got to be a better way. And so he uses kind of John Locke's principles of toleration. Everyone today, I mean, tolerance is like the thing, right? And Constant was like, well, the Christians are being intolerant. Let's be the tolerant ones. Let's like welcome everybody. And so you get these bad images that later developed of like all religions are the same. We're all going up the same mountain. We're just starting at different sides. The thing about liberalism is once you got to the top, there is no God up there. It's just everybody got to the top. And I think that Newman saw that is inimical. That is against everything a Christian or even a Jew would believe. God came and directly spoke. That's what we call revelation. He directly came to us, both in word and then as the person of Jesus Christ. And so Newman saw that as, although it sounds great, like let's just be tolerant and if you're a good Buddhist, you're a good Buddhist. What's the matter with that? That would be kind of a liberal idea of religion. And Newman was like, yeah, but the Christian claim is not going to buy that. Because then that excludes what God can do. Can't God come down and can't he take his own initiatives if he's really God?
What I think is interesting about this, too, this is where if you want to talk about a distinction between a liberal tradition and a radical one, and then also like a Christian or a classical one, however you want to put this, because people get this idea, I mean, this is a whole other show that we could bring up, but I think it's apropos to what we're bringing up. Is liberalism then in too easy of a way sort of Christian head in the sand, let's not think through these like we're advocating? Well, then anything not Christian must be liberal. But to shots fired on the radio, so Karl Marx and his tradition is definitively not liberal then, precisely for what you said, that he thinks like whatever else he is as a materialist, he's like, there's an order that can be verified against. And so there's not, and they're not tolerant, right? There's not this idea. And Marx, in some ways, says something similar to Newman, which is the liberal mindset, the habit of mind that allows there to be sort of a deferred ultimate questions for the sake of tolerance. That is a political move in itself because it occludes or hides what actually is happening in politics. So there's all sorts of things going on in Newman's world. I mean, we are like smack dab in the middle of like colonialism and then what the colonies are going to do. Newman dies right before the great revolutions of the 20th century are going to start kicking off in due order. And Newman is the one, right, on that side that's pointing out, liberalism, because of what it says about its sort of indifferentist position, which is where actually Freemasonry comes in, not to like be some sort of big conspiracy theorist person, but like the actual intellectual positions of the Masons in England is indifferentism, which is this idea that like we can actually back off all of these metaphysical questions so that British imperialism can just keep happening. And we don't need to get in big fights. We can all go to universities and sort of just learn stuff so British imperialism can keep happening. And so I think it's interesting, right, that it's actually the radical tradition and Newman around the same time, Dave, figuring this out. And Bud, what I think this like directly does, I think of your book, the book you wrote on Newman is about development of doctrine. And so this is sort of like an inverse development of doctrine. People who accuse Newman of like sort of tacking on liberalism at the end, you guys were both saying this as the scholars at the break. He didn't use it early on because liberalism itself hadn't sort of developed into putting that definitive a point on it. But Newman saw it clearly through the many arguments he had been having.
Yeah, there's a way that you could hear this conversation and misunderstand us as thinking like Catholics, there's a virtue to being combative for the sake of being combative. And it's like if we're living peacefully alongside, say, Muslims and Buddhists, we're doing it wrong. And that would be a complete misunderstanding. There's actually been stages in Western history where Muslims and Jews and Christians lived alongside each other. They weren't liberal in any sense. They didn't organize their lives around a liberal order, but they lived in peace. But what we're trying to point out, Bo and Dave, I think, is like there's a hegemonic nature to liberalism that's easily looked past. And what I mean by that is it leads with the virtue of tolerance, but it ultimately wants to place the same claim on your life that the church, I mean, to be frank, does. And so I think today, at this stage in our history, we're sort of reaching the limits of liberalism. What I mean by that is, like, it tells this whole story about living peaceably, but we see in places like England, for instance, and I'm not picking on Islam, like, in saying this, but just like in the Muslim tradition, there's certain laws and things that have to do with their public political life, Sharia law, and it doesn't fit easily into the liberal order that advanced Western democracies have built, and so they don't know exactly what to do with that. And there is a way in which, not a way, like truly what Jesus Christ, what our Lord preached, runs up against liberal claims. Because if you have someone who claims divine authority and says, like, to follow me, you must pick up your cross daily, tells you to love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you, turn the other cheek, give without expecting anything in return, ultimately, the liberal order is going to see those things as dangerous, just as the Pax Romana did. And so the peace that Christ said he was bringing, it does run, like, there's a paradox there. He came to bring peace, peace be with you, but he also brought a sword, and there's this division that we inevitably sort of like are drawn into by following Jesus.
Dave, as you get ready to answer that, like, to me, just so people understand, like, a firm example of what we're talking about, of liberalism taking something the church has done and sort of making not even a photocopy, but like a cousin of that thing, but then sort of undermining the whole concept. An easy one is the difference between charity and philanthropy. Like, who wouldn't, philos anthropos, right? Like the lover of man. Who wouldn't want to do philanthropy? But philanthropy is a completely different animal in the end than charity. And that, to me, is sort of like an easy way to keep in mind what we're meaning when liberalism takes, like you said, language of the church, but to do something very different with that habit of mind.
Right, like if you think about Christian love, like it's a sacrificial love for others, agape, and you have a guy, I'd say another architect of liberalism, Auguste Comte. He coins a word called altruism. Everybody loves altruism, right? But what it is it's a poor man's Christian love. And meaning it's where Christians have ended
Harold Miner of Christian. Sorry, all those 1990 Michael Jordan. Sorry, Baby Jordan. Yeah. Sorry.
4% would be pretty good.
Yeah.
Baby Jordan.
but I think that it's that kind of concept of altruism. For example, everybody's like, well, yeah, we should be nice to others, and that's where you get like so. What liberalism kind of gives us is not like a love Christianity, it gives us a nice Christianity. Mm-hmm. And because that is controllable, right? Like a loving Christianity is like, Jesuits who are going to far-fetched countries and like, I'll give up my life and I'm good for that. A nice Christianity is like, well, I do have to travel in business class. Well, at least I have like enough leg room to get there. And like, I do have to have air conditioning when I do this. Meaning that like the love of Christianity, like the love preaching Christianity, it's both hard and merciful, like all at once. Nice Christianity can't ever do that because it wants the pleasures that accompany it. That's controllable by like the liberal order, if you will. I do find it interesting. So there's things. A book came out a few years ago, Enlightenment Now by Steven Pinker, about how great the liberal order is and how, what's interesting I find is under the liberal order, nuclear weapons, massive world wars, like overthrows of governments, assassinations.
Total side note, but who I thought did a really good takedown of this and keep going is Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who we've talked about on this show before, who just goes to show, he says, like, this is sort of like the preeminent way of backfilling data to support a claim.
Right.
Where you're like, you currently like have a clean road, and you're like, what got you here? To your point, right? Like,
right. So, and part of the way the liberal order was able to ascend, especially in England under Gladstone, which is like it was future focused. So it's we're looking forward. We're going to progress. We're going to move throughout the world with colonial, But they thought that we're spreading democracy. This is a good thing. We're bringing this to the unenlightened masses of the world. The problem is with it. there wasn't necessarily mercy as a component of it, and it was exploitative and whatnot. Even though Christians were obviously a part of this, they were being kind of sucked into that whirlpool. And I think that what's kind of important about how Newman helps us think about it is you do need to check your own first principles. Like, are you as skeptical or are you willing to believe? For Newman, belief is not the same thing as an opinion. An opinion is kind of I like that type of hot dog versus that type of hamburger, that type stuff. A belief is something that you're like, there's a core commitment to that. That really is where you are. And so Newman said that's not interchangeable. You can change your opinions on a lot of things, but beliefs are much stickier and harder to change. And, but people do change them. And liberalism provided a way for Christians. It gave them cover. I'm being altruistic. I'm being philanthropic. I'm being nice, right? That's good enough, right? I mean, that's what Jesus wanted. And that Newman saw the danger in that and saying that was where he kind of buckled down and was like, Christianity is not like that. Whatever it is, it's not that. And so, people look, well, you're being so intolerant by saying this, but Newman was like, you got to know what Christianity is saying.
And that's where, Dave, for me, I think in some of these recent arguments about what Newman said, sometimes theologians or historians kind of want to make it about, was he precise in his terminology? And oddly enough, they sort of avoid the conversation that he was driving. Like what Newman says is that faith places a claim on your life, and liberalism kind of wants to neutralize that. We've got a good friend in Catholic studies, Cyril O'Regan, great theologian and scholar, and he talked about like when the church was ready to canonize Newman, some scholars said like, well, if you make this guy a saint, it's going to throw off like the objective study of his life because it'll be hagiography and sort of like we'll just look at Newman through rose-tinted glasses. And Cyril's great because he points out and he does the homework and looks at what they wrote, and he says like what some of these writers object to is not Newman as a saint, but the very idea of holiness, like what the Catholic Church was teaching about sainthood itself. As we were having this conversation, it called to mind another passage from Newman kind of tying this all together. You know how with St. Francis, like he's like a hardcore saint, but we sometimes sort of like domesticate him, and he's like the brown robe guy who sort of like petted animals, things like this. I think we can do this with Newman. Now, Newman here, as he's writing, he may be engaging in hyperbole as a rhetorical device, but he says, like there's kind of these debates going around me today where like, does the Catholic Church actually make society a better place? He says the debates miss the point because the Catholic Church holds it better for the sun and moon to drop from heaven, for the earth to fill, and for all the many millions on it to die of starvation and extremist agony as far as temporal affliction goes, then that one soul I will not say should be lost, but should commit one single venial sin, should tell one willful untruth, or should steal one poor farthing without excuse. If you take Newman at his word there, he's no liberal, and he's serious about holiness, and I think we've kind of lost that part of Newman. I love him for his writings on education. I love him for his subtlety of thought and what he said about the intellect. He even, like you said, he praised parts of liberalism and sort of like the sort of like liberality of mind and its willingness to engage other viewpoints and things like that, to go about life with a certain kind of sophisticatedness and an English sense or whatnot. But here he gets down to brass tacks. He says the church is serious about holiness, and it's not about necessarily like making the world a better place. We could have that conversation, but it's got a whole different mission and purpose that it's concerned about. Well,
Bud, it's harder than, I don't know how we'd put a better a finer point on it. So we'll end there, but with the remaining time for this segment, Dave, you mentioned the Newman idea. Of course, I worked with you with that. It's doing great work. If people want to engage not only maybe essays you've written or just your general work in honor of John Henry Newman, where are places they can go find that out to take a look?
So we have a website, newmanidea.org, and it's getting a little bit of a reboot. We're doing some really fun stuff. We've been at Tulane University. We're going into our 5th year at Tulane University. We're going into our 2nd year at the University of Houston. But we've also expanded the ministry into high schools, and we're starting to work with high school students. and we're seeing unbelievable benefits. And what we do is we do two things. We mentor. So we want to walk with people and accompany them so that they can develop these habits of mind and habits of heart. And the other thing is we provide these seminars that really give young minds the ability to kind of let loose and kind of ask the questions, but not only ask questions, engage with each other, create a community, but we also guide the questions, and we ask big questions. We just did the other night. We did a whole session on liberty. And all the guys went around in the room and they talked about what freedom means to them. And by the end of it, they were kind of like, wow, it means all these different things. Like, what is the definition? And that's where we kind of come in and help them focus and grow and say, well, here's a good working definition to work with. And what we find is paying off in like their future studies, what they want to, because it's creating a habit of mind and opening it. And I think that's what Newman always wanted. He wants the liberality of mind, right? But he doesn't want you to be a skeptic about it. He wants you to be a believer. One of the greatest things about Newman in the 19th century is belief was his first principle, not doubt. And the modern world begins with doubt, and it tries to find belief. And Newman's like, no, belief finds belief.
Well, on that note, so real quick, what's the website again?
www.newmanidea.org.
Dave, always fantastic to have you with us. Like I said, one of our you're an all-star multiple times over onto The Uncommon Good. It's great to have you. This is The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. Stick around. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. So wonderful to have you with us. Bud, wonderful to have Dave Delio with us. I hope people see, Bud, why we sort of saved that interview with Dave to put here after we've considered a lot of Newman's work, a lot of his homilies and sermons. That whole book is, of course, something you can really dig into, but particularly Dave Delio's article, his chapter, I should say, very prescient and very important to really understand Newman foundationally.
Yeah, great chapter, great mind, Dave. It's fun. In our field, we get to meet and develop great friendships with people from around the country. We've been blessed sometimes at conferences and symposia to run into people like Dave, and it's amazing to me. We like sometimes to kind of poo-poo technology and how social media and things complicates our lives, but like some of these friendships, I can't imagine, I don't even know how many years ago when I first met Dave, and just hearing him today and hearing his great insights on Newman and just thinking about that journey.
I'm really happy that we've had the chance to dig into Newman, not only in a sort of broad way, like we did at the beginning of the radio reading roundup, but also to get the chance to sort of top off everything, really delving into, you two are both experts in the field, and to hear you sort of your considerations about this, I just feel lucky. It's been an early Christmas gift. So thank you, Santa Dave Delio, for wrapping that up nicely for us.
Yeah, and as we journey towards Christmas, please join us in our prayer life. We pray the rosary on air at 6 in the morning and then at 10 a.m. The Chaplet of Divine Mercy at 2:55 in the afternoon. You can use the Iowa Catholic Radio app anytime, anywhere to pray the rosary.
But here I usually plug iowacatholicradio.com and the events page. We're kind of in a pause. I think the next event listed is like in April. But one more time, let's just give a big shout out to how wonderful the dinner in December was. I hope many of you listening were able to be a part of that. I know Bud and I had a great time. Embassy Suites.
The MC was kind of subpar, but everyone else... I thought Joe Teeling did great.
Yeah.
Loved Dave Anders.
But who's that one guy? Yeah. I felt bad for John because, evidently everyone who was given the mic other than him went to Iowa, even Dave Anders. So that was a weird surprise.
It was a very strong pro Hawkeye crowd, and when John would slip in some friendly ribbing, I felt like the energy in the room got kind of intense.
I know. There wasn't enough punting jokes. I feel like you and I could have made that happen, but
next year
it worked out. But even though we don't have events to point you to, here at the end of the year, please prayerfully consider donating. We're still seeking to make up a bit of deficit with our donations here at the end of the year. You can donate at iowacatholicradio.com on the Iowa Catholic Radio app, 515-223-1150, either calling or texting. If you were there, you know that we have big news about how we're spreading the signal through towers. Our podcast, like many who listen to our show on the podcast, that footprint has been expanding as well. So many interesting things going on, but in order to make them happen, we need you to prayerfully consider donating, making that gift so that your ministry and our ministry can keep expanding here in Central Iowa. Bud, as always, wonderful to talk to you, and I'm just going to say it. I think you and I were really great at bringing out the best of Dave Delio. He should really appreciate that.
And also trivia. Trivia Champs 2024.
This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good, and we'll be back next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one, and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.